Hello, my name is Terrence Blackwell, a member of the Cherokee Nation, raised in a small town near the Blue Ridge Mountains. In 1998, while working as a forest ranger, a job I loved because it allowed me to immerse myself in nature, away from the noise and chaos of the city, I experienced an event that to this day I still struggle to fully comprehend. It's a story that changed my life forever. It all began one late spring day when a couple went missing near an area called Pine Hollow. This place wasn't a popular hiking spot. Most locals didn't even know it existed. But Pine Hollow had a certain reputation, with whispered stories about strange lights and eerie sounds. I had never paid much attention to those tales, always assuming they were just superstitions. However, when the couple didn't return from their hike, the local sheriff's department requested our assistance. I was assigned to join two other rangers, Jonah Bright and Eliza Malone. Jonah was a large man with a serious, no-nonsense attitude, having served in the military. He faced everything with determination and resolve, never allowing fear or doubt to control him. In contrast, Eliza was small and agile, with a sharp mind and a knack for finding humor in any situation. She was the light and energy of the team, always knowing how to ease tension with a funny story or gentle teasing. But that day, despite all our differences, there was one thing that unified the three of us: our mission to find the missing couple and bring them back. We set out early in the morning, just as the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the dense canopy of trees. The path leading into Pine Hollow was overgrown with weeds and brush, clearly showing that not many people had ventured there in recent times. We walked for hours, continuously calling out the names Lisa and Mark Hanley, but there was no response. By midday we found their campsite. However, the sight that greeted us sent a chill down my spine. The tent was half collapsed, and camping gear was scattered around as if they had left in a panic. I noticed an old Polaroid camera among the mess and picked it up. Camera was still functional, and out of curiosity, I pressed the shutter. Blurry photo appeared. Through it, I could make out a faint silhouette in the distance, resembling a human figure. Jonah and Eliza had already started examining the surrounding area for any signs or tracks. "Terrence, come take a look at this," Jonah called out. He was kneeling by a patch of disturbed earth. "It looks like there was a struggle here. See these drag marks?" His voice was tense, his eyes scanning the forest around us. Eliza, meanwhile, found another set of tracks leading deeper into the woods. "These tracks don't look human," she muttered, her voice filled with doubt. I bent down to observe, noticed the tracks were longer than usual, almost like someone walking on their toes, but much larger than normal. My first thought was that they might be from a bear, but bears don't leave tracks like these. We decided to follow the tracks, and as we ventured deeper into the forest, a growing sense of unease gradually settled over the three of us. Forest grew denser, the canopy blocking out the sunlight, making the air around us unusually cold for late spring. Eliza joked that it felt like the perfect setting for a horror movie, but no one laughed. Not long after, we found Lisa, or rather what was left of her. Her body lay twisted in an unnatural position in a small clearing. There were no signs of a struggle or blood, just her lifeless form staring blankly up at the sky. Jonah checked her pulse, though we all knew it was futile. "She's gone," he said, his voice calm and emotionless. We tried to radio for help, but the signal wouldn't connect. We had ventured too deep into Pine Hollow, too far from any cell towers. Jonah suggested we head back, but Eliza and I were determined to find Mark. We argued for a while, but eventually, Jonah relented. We pressed on, the atmosphere growing more oppressive with each step. As night fell, we set up camp and took turns keeping watch. It was my shift when I heard it. A low, guttural sound, not quite animal, not entirely human either. I gently nudged Jonah awake and we both listened. The sound came again, closer this time. We woke Eliza, The three of us sat in tense silence, listening to the darkness. Suddenly, something crashed through the underbrush nearby. Jonah flicked on his flashlight, catching a brief glimpse of something that made my blood run cold. It was tall and gaunt, with long limbs and pale, almost translucent skin. Its eyes were large, black, and devoid of emotion. It disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, leaving us in stunned silence. "What the hell was that?" Eliza whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know, but we need to get out of here," Jonah replied, hastily packing up his gear. No one argued. We started back the way we came, moving as quickly and quietly as possible. The feeling of being watched hung over us, and every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made us jump. After what felt like endless hours of walking, we stumbled upon an old, dilapidated cabin, barely visible in the darkness. It appeared abandoned, but it was the only shelter we had. We decided to take refuge there for the night. Inside, the air was musty and filled with old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. We barricaded the door and sat in a circle, our flashlights casting light on our anxious faces. We tried to rest, but none of us could sleep. Around midnight, the sounds started again. But this time, they were closer. Right outside the cabin, scratching noises, low moans, and something that sounded like whispering. Jonah gripped his gun tightly. Even he looked terrified. And then it happened. The door burst open, and the creature lunged at us. Jonah shot it in the shoulder, but it barely seemed to notice. He grabbed Eliza, dragging her toward the door. I rushed at it with my hunting knife, slashing wildly. I managed to cut its arm, and it let out a horrifying scream, dropping Eliza. Jonah fired another shot, this time hitting it in the chest. Creature stumbled, then disappeared into the night. Eliza was shaken but alive. She had a deep gash on her leg where the creature had grabbed her. We patched her up as best we could and waited for dawn. When the first light appeared, we left the cabin, supporting Eliza between us. No one spoke much, each of us lost in our own thought. When we finally returned to civilization, we reported everything to the sheriff. They organized a search party, but found no trace of the creature or Mark Hanley. Eliza left the ranger service shortly after, moving to another state. Jonah stayed, but he was never the same. Quieter, always looking over his shoulder. As for me, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had encountered something not of this world. I did some research and spoke to some of the elders in my community. They told me stories about the Nunahi spirits, beings that are neither good nor evil, but can be very dangerous if disturbed. My name is Jolan Blackwood, and this story happened to me in 1998. At that time, I was 27 years old, living in a small town called Red Ridge, nestled deep in the Colorado Rockies. Red Ridge was a place where everyone knew each other, and life moved at a slow, peaceful pace. I worked as a mechanic, fixing trucks and snowmobiles, and on weekends, I enjoyed hiking and fishing in the surrounding wilderness. It was a simple, peaceful life until that summer. Everything started to change when a hiker went missing. Wes Abernathy, a journalist from Denver, had come to town to write a piece about life in small places like Red Ridge. He had been here for a week, talking to people and making a good impression with his friendliness and curiosity. One morning, he decided to hike up to Bear's Claw Ridge, a popular spot known for its stunning views. But Wes never came back. I didn't know Wes well, but we had shared a few beers at the local bar, the Stag, a few nights before he disappeared. He struck me as a decent guy, full of stories and questions. When Wes went missing, the whole town became anxious. Search parties were organized, scouring the trails and the forest, but there was no trace of him. It was as if Wes had vanished into thin air. A week later, I received a call from Sheriff Tate. He asked if I could assist in the search, given my knowledge of the local terrain. I agreed, thinking it was the least I could do to help. The next morning, I met the search party at the edge of the forest. There were about a dozen people, including Sheriff Tate, his deputy, and a few of Wes's friends from Denver who had come to help. We split into groups and headed out. I was paired with Clyde, a burly lumberjack with a thick beard and a booming voice. Clyde and I had known each other for years, and we quickly fell into a rhythm as we hiked along the trail. The forest was dense, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. It was quiet, save for the occasional chirp of a bird or the rustling of leaves. We had been hiking for a few hours when we came across something strange. There was a patch of disturbed ground where the underbrush had been trampled flat, and a few feet away, a torn piece of fabric was caught on a bush. It looked like it could have come from Wes's jacket. Clyde and I called out, but there was no response. We marked the spot and radioed the sheriff, then continued our search, feeling a growing sense of unease as the sky began to darken with storm clouds. We decided to head back, not wanting to get caught in the rain. On the way down, we took a different route, hoping to cover more ground. That's when we found the cave. The entrance was partially hidden by vines and bushes, and if we hadn't been looking closely, we might have walked right past it. It was a narrow opening, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Clyde and I exchanged looks. "Do you think he could be in there?" I asked. "Only one way to find out," Clyde replied, pulling a flashlight from his pack. We crouched down, the beam of the flashlight flickering as it cut through the darkness. The air inside the cave was cold and damp, with a musty smell that hit our noses immediately. We moved slowly, the sound of our footsteps echoing off the stone walls. After a few minutes, the passage opened up into a larger chamber, and that's when we saw it. Wes's body was sprawled on the ground, his face pale and his eyes wide open in horror. He looked like he had been dead for several days. Deep scratches marked his arms and face, and his clothes were torn to shreds. But what sent a chill down my spine wasn't Wes's body. It was the thing standing right next to him. At first, I thought it was a person, but as the flashlight beam landed on it, I realized it was something entirely different. It was tall, gaunt, with ashen gray skin and sickly glowing yellow eyes. Its long, spindly arms ended in sharp, claw-like fingers. It turned to look at us, and I felt a cold chill run down my spine. Clyde cursed under his breath and took a step back. "What the hell is that?" whispered. "I don't know," I replied, my voice barely a weak whisper, "but we need to get out of here." We slowly backed away, trying to move as quickly and quietly as possible. Once outside, we started running, neither of us saying a word until we reached the trailhead, gasping for breath in fear. We radioed the sheriff, and just a few minutes later, he arrived with a couple of deputies. We recounted what we had seen, and they went into the cave to investigate. Clyde and I waited by the cars, too terrified to do anything else. When the sheriff and his men returned, they looked pale and shaken. They had found Wes's body, but there was no sign of the creature. The sheriff told us to keep quiet about what we had seen, not wanting to cause a panic in the town. He said they would report the incident as an animal attack and leave it at that. Life in Red Ridge went back to normal, or at least as normal as it could after something like that. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't seen the last of that creature. The nightmare started. I saw those glowing eyes every time I closed my own. Clyde and I kept in touch, checking in on each other regularly, but we never talked about what had happened. It was like an unspoken agreement. We had witnessed something terrible, and talking about it wouldn't change anything. A few weeks later, another hiker went missing. This time, it was a local girl named Marcy. The search parties were organized again, but I didn't join in this time. I couldn't bring myself to go back into those woods. Marcy's body was found a few days later in a different part of the forest. The sheriff reported it as another animal attack, but I knew better. The town started to change after that. People became more cautious, less friendly. The forest, once a place of beauty and peace, became a source of fear. Parents kept their children close, and fewer hikers came through. Local businesses suffered, and the town's economy took a hit. It was like a dark cloud had settled over Red Ridge, and there was no shaking it off. I thought about leaving, moving somewhere far away and starting fresh. But this was my home, and despite everything, I couldn't bring myself to leave. Instead, I tried to move on, throwing myself into my work and trying to forget what I had seen. But it was always there, lurking in the back of my mind. One evening, I was sitting on my porch, nursing a beer and watching the sun set behind the mountains, when Clyde showed up. He looked more haggard than ever, with dark circles under his eyes and a haunted look on his face. "I saw it," he whispered. "Saw what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "That thing. In my dreams. And sometimes when I'm out in the woods I catch a glimpse of it, just for a second, but it's there." I didn't know what to say. I had experienced the same thing, but hearing it from Clyde made it all feel more real. "Do you think it's still out there?" I asked. Clyde nodded. "Yeah, and I think it's hunting. I don't know why, but I can feel it." We sat in silence for a long time, just the weight of his words settling over us. I realized that this wasn't something we could just ignore. That creature was still out there. More people could get hurt. We had to do something. The next morning, Clyde and I went to see Sheriff Tate. We told him about our encounters, the nightmares, the sightings. At first, he was skeptical, but the look in our eyes must have convinced him. He agreed to help us, though he made it clear that this was off the books. He didn't want to cause a panic, and he didn't want any more attention on our town. We spent a few days preparing. We gathered supplies, mapped out the area, and made a plan. We knew it was dangerous, but we couldn't just sit by and do nothing. On the morning of our search, we set out early, just as the sun was rising. There were 6 of us. Clyde, Sheriff Tate, his deputy, and a couple of Clyde's friends from the lumberyard. We were armed with rifles and flashlights, ready for whatever we might encounter. The forest was eerily quiet as we made our way to the cave. When we reached it, the entrance looked even smaller than before, as if it was trying to hide from us. We squeezed through, the cold air sending shivers down my spine. The cave seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning in the darkness. After what felt like an eternity, we reached the chamber where we had found Wes. His body was gone, but the stench of decay still lingered in the air. We spread out, searching for any sign of the creature. Sheriff Tate was the first to find a clue. A pile of gnawed bones scattered across the floor. These bones didn't look like they came from any animal I'd ever seen. As we ventured deeper into the cave, the sense of dread grew stronger. The walls seemed to close in around us, and the air grew colder. We entered another chamber, larger than the first, and that's when we saw it again. The creature was standing in the center of the room, its yellow eyes glowing in the darkness. This time, we were ready. Sheriff Tate raised his rifle, and the others followed suit. But before we could fire, the creature moved. It was fast, faster than anything I had ever seen. Darted around the room, its movements a blur. Clyde and I fired our guns, the shots echoing off the walls, but we couldn't hit it. The creature lunged at us, its claws slashing through the air. It struck Clyde on the arm, and he fell with a scream. The others kept firing, and finally, one of the bullets hit its mark. The creature let out a roar, its body convulsing as it collapsed to the ground. We didn't wait to see if it was dead. We lifted Clyde and ran, not stopping until we reached the trailhead. We got Clyde to the hospital just in time. His wound was deep, but the doctors managed to save his arm. Sheriff Tate told us to keep quiet about what had happened, and we agreed. We didn't want to cause any more fear or panic in the town, but we knew the truth. There was something out there, something dangerous, and it was only a matter of time before it struck again. In the weeks that followed, Red Ridge slowly began to return to normal. The search for Marcy continued, but there was no sign of her. The forest remained a place of fear, but life went on. Clyde recovered from his injury, though he was never quite the same. We kept our promise to the sheriff, but the nightmares never went away. I still live in Red Ridge, still work as a mechanic, still hike the trails, but I'm always on edge, always looking over my shoulder. I don't know if we killed that creature or if it's still out there, lurking in the shadows. But one thing is certain, I'll never forget those yellow eyes or the fear that gripped me that night. And I'll always be ready, just in case it comes back. My name is Orrin Redfeather, born and raised on the Mescalero Apache Reservation in New Mexico. My life has always been intertwined with stories, some real, some mythical, about the land, people, and the creatures that hide just out of sight. My childhood was spent in long summer days, surrounded by family, gatherings, and the occasional hunting trip with my father and uncle. Everything seemed simple until I received a call from an old friend named Elias Whiteclay in the summer of 2013. Elias was a high school friend, and although we hadn't talked much since graduation, I knew he had some experience with hunting and tracking. When Elias called, there was something strange in his voice, almost a hint of fear, piqued my curiosity. He said that a few friends had invited him to go hunting in the Sacramento Mountains, and Elias needed my help to track some of the animals they planned to hunt. It sounded like a good opportunity to reconnect and enjoy the outdoors, so I agreed to join them. Early the next morning, Elias picked me up in his old beat-up truck. We talked about the past, life, and small things as Elias drove along the narrow dirt road, surrounded by thick trees with cool morning air filling the space around us. When we reached the base of the mountains, we met up with Elias's two friends, Alex, a tall, quiet guy with a serious demeanor, and John, the opposite, always smiling and cracking jokes. The contrast between the two added a lively dynamic to our group. We began driving up the mountain, the road becoming rougher and the trees growing denser. The air started to get colder as we ventured deeper into the forest. After an hour of driving, we arrived at a small clearing where we planned to set up camp. The area was eerily quiet, with no sounds except for the wind rustling through the leaves. There was something in the air that made me feel uneasy, but I kept quiet, thinking it was just the strangeness of returning to the forest after a long time. First day passed uneventfully. We scouted the surrounding area, set up some trail cameras, and spent the evening around the campfire, sharing stories and laughing. The forest was so quiet that it was almost unimaginable, as if it was holding on to some secret that we hadn't yet realized. But the cozy atmosphere and the lively stories made us all forget about that strange feeling. The next morning, we split into two groups to go hunting. Elias and Alex went one way, while John and I took a different path. We walked for hours, tracking signs but not encountering any game. As the sun began to set, we decided to head back to camp. That's when things started to get strange. We heard a scream echoing from afar. It wasn't an animal's scream. It was clearly human, reverberating through the trees and sending chills down my spine. John and I looked at each other, eyes wide, and without a word, we both ran toward the sound. The sky began to darken, and the forest seemed to close in around us, as if it wanted to swallow up all traces of light. We burst into the clearing where the scream had come from, and the sight before us froze us in our tracks. Elias and Alex were standing there, but they weren't the source of the scream. In front of them was a body, or what was left of it, a man torn apart with blood soaking into the ground. Elias was pale, his hands trembling. We walked in silence, each step heavy with the weight of anxiety. Every little sound startled us, our eyes darting around, searching for any sign of danger. When we finally made it back to the truck, Elias managed to catch a weak signal, just enough to call the local sheriff's office and report what we had found. They told us to stay put, that they would send someone out immediately. We built a small fire and sat with our backs to each other, listening intently to every noise in the forest. No one spoke a word. It was the longest stretch of time I had ever experienced, each second dragging on in the tense silence. Then, we saw the headlights in the distance, and a group of officers appeared. They took us back to the station to get our statements and began investigating the scene. The sheriff was an older man, his face lined with wrinkles but exuding a sense of strength. He pulled me aside, his sharp eyes scrutinizing every word I said. "Have you ever seen anything like this before?" he asked, his voice low and heavy. I shook my head. "Never. This isn't any animal I know." He nodded, his face serious. "We need to get the body out of here and conduct a thorough investigation. You boys should head back to town. We'll be in touch." We packed up our gear and drove back in silence, the heavy atmosphere lingering like a dark cloud over us. On the drive back, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, that we hadn't truly escaped whatever horrific thing we had encountered. I caught glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye. When I turned to look, there was nothing there. Sleep became difficult, and when I did manage to sleep, I was haunted by nightmare. About a week later, Elias called me. His voice was shaky, something I had never heard from him before. "They found another body," he said, almost swallowing his words. "Same condition. This isn't an animal, Oren. This is something else." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to go back and figure out what was happening, but another part of me was terrified at the thought. We decided to meet up and talk things through. Maybe there was something we missed, a clue that could explain what was going on. We gathered at Elias's house, a small cabin on the edge of the reservation. Alex and John were also there, both looking just as exhausted and anxious as I felt. We went over everything we remembered, trying to piece together the events, but nothing seemed to add up. The attacks were random, yet the brutality was a common thread. John suggested that we go back to the area, this time armed, to see if we could find anything. The idea sounded crazy. We all needed answers. We geared up, rifles slung over our shoulders, giving us a false sense of security. The forest was no longer the peaceful place it had been before. The silence was still there, but this time, it wasn't the comforting quiet of nature. It was a heavy, oppressive silence, pressing down on our mind. We made our way to the clearing where we had found the first body. A strange, rancid smell lingered in the air, faint but unmistakable. We split into smaller groups, always keeping within shouting distance to avoid getting separated. I moved through the trees, scanning the ground, hoping to find some clue. Suddenly, I heard Alex scream. I ran towards the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached him, I saw Alex standing there, his face pale, staring at another body. This one was fresher, with blood still pooling around it. Alex looked up at me, eyes filled with confusion. "What the hell is doing this?" he asked, his voice trembling. Before I could answer, we heard a noise behind us. We both turned, guns raised. In the dim light, we saw a hunched figure. It moved with an unnatural speed, darting between the trees like a shadow. We fired, the shots echoing through the forest. It didn't stop. We gave chase, driven by fear and adrenaline. The creature led us deeper into the woods, where the trees grew thicker and the light faded. We lost sight of it. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. Then suddenly Elias screamed. We turned to see him on the ground, clutching his leg, blood seeping through his fingers. The creature was gone, but the air felt heavy and ominous as if it was lurking somewhere nearby. We lifted Elias, trying to get back to the truck as quickly as possible. Our breaths were ragged. All we wanted was to escape this dangerous area. When we returned to the clearing where we had camped, our breaths still hadn't steadied. John stayed with Elias, while Alex and I continued to search the surrounding area, hoping to find any trace of the creature. Came across a small cave, half hidden by dense foliage. Inside, The rancid smell was even stronger. The floor of the cave was littered with bones, some from animals, others unmistakably human. We backed out, fear washing over us, as if the creature was watching us from the shadows. I felt a sharp pain in my side. Turning around, I saw the creature, its eyes glowing in the darkness. It was humanoid but twisted, with long limbs and sharp teeth. I dodged its attack, raised my rifle, and fired. The creature let out a screech, then fled, leaving a trail of blood on the cave floor. We didn't chase after it. Instead, we focused on getting Elias to safety. The journey back was chaotic, as we tried to stay alert and hoped we would make it out of the forest safely. When we reached the hospital, Elias was unconscious. The doctors managed to save him just in time. The wounds looked like bite marks, but they didn't resemble any animal the doctors had ever seen. We recounted the story to the police, who promised to investigate further. But as the weeks passed, the forest grew silent. The creature was never found, and the killing stopped. The fear lingered. We couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, lurking, waiting. Elias recovered, but was never the same again. We gradually drifted apart, unable to confront the memories of what had happened. My name is a quasi-red eagle, and the story I'm about to tell happened in 1987, when I was working as a ranger at Petrified Forest National Park in Arizona. Life there wasn't the most exciting, but I loved the job because it allowed me to be outdoors, surrounded by the raw beauty of the desert and ancient petrified trees. It was a job that many might find mundane, but for me, it was a connection to the earth, the ancestors, and to the mysteries the desert held close. That day started like any other. I was driving on patrol through the northern part of the park, the least frequented area, where the petrified trees lay scattered like ancient bones buried in the sand. Evening was slowly descending, with the sun painting the sky in soft hues of orange and pink. I felt a strange peace, a feeling I often experienced when alone in the vast openness of the desert. As I drove along the dirt road, a glint of metal caught my eye. It was an old, abandoned camper, looking as if it had been there for years, its paint faded and peeling. A sense of curiosity drew me closer. I parked next to the camper, stepped out, and approached it. The door was slightly ajar, creaking softly in the gentle breeze. I hesitated for a moment before deciding to step inside. The air inside was musty, the stench of rotting wood and mildew filling my nostrils. The interior of the camper was completely destroyed, littered with trash and broken furniture. I was about to leave when my eye caught sight of a small notebook lying amidst the debris on the floor. I picked it up and flipped through a few pages. The notebook was a diary, recording the fragmented and paranoid thoughts of a man who had lived in isolation in the desert. The entries were filled with frantic scribblings about strange noises in the night, shadows that seemed to watch him, and a pervasive sense of fear. The last pages were chaotic, almost unreadable, but one message repeated throughout: "It's coming." I was reading one of the final entries when I heard a sound outside. It was the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, like those of a large creature. My heart pounded as I stepped out, hoping it was just my imagination. But when I called out, only silence responded. I quickly made my way back to my Jeep, my eyes constantly scanning the long shadows cast by the surrounding rocks. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. The words from the notebook kept haunting me, swirling around in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there in the darkness, something that shouldn't exist but was somehow present here, in this desolate desert. Finally, I decided to go back the next morning to investigate further. I shared the story with my close friend and colleague, Eliezer. He just laughed loudly when he heard it, dismissing it as the overactive imagination. Lonely old man. But when I showed him the notebook, Eliezer's expression changed instantly. "We should go back and check out that camper," said, his voice serious. We decided to go together, this time with more preparation. The next morning, before the sun was high in the sky, we drove back to where I had seen the camper. The dusty road and ancient rocks created a scene that was both majestic and eerie. As we approached, I noticed something had changed. Growing up in this land, I knew when the desert wasn't right. Today, I felt it more clearly than ever. Before stepping into the camper, we noticed large footprints leading deeper into the desert. They were too large to be human, yet they didn't match any animal tracks I had ever seen. The footprints were shaped like those of a monster, sharp claws etched deeply into the sand. Paulides looked at me, his eyes full of doubt. "We have to follow them," he said, but I could hear the hesitation in his voice. We grabbed our rifles and began tracking the footprint. The trail led us into a part of the desert we rarely ventured into. The terrain grew harsher, with steep cliffs and deep ravines. Further we went, the heavier the air became, as if something was watching us from the ancient rocks, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. After more than an hour of walking, we reached a small cave, half hidden behind large boulders. The footprints led straight into the darkness. We stopped, exchanging serious glances. "Are you sure about this?" Paulides asked, his eyes betraying his anxiety. "No," I replied honestly, "but we can't turn back without knowing what's causing this." We crawled into the cave, our flashlights illuminating a narrow, damp path. Air was cold and heavy, a stark contrast to the searing heat of the desert outside. The cave walls were covered in ancient drawings, similar to the petroglyphs I had seen before, but these had a strange, unsettling feel to them. They depicted creatures unlike humans, with sharp teeth and glowing eyes. We continued deeper into the cave, and these drawings became more vivid and terrifying. Finally, we reached a large chamber where the cave's ceiling soared high above, and the light from our flashlights illuminated a horrifying scene. In the center of the room, on a crude stone altar, was a pile of human bones, arranged in a shape resembling an altar. The bones were shattered, clear marks of gnawing. The air was thick with the stench of death and decay. A laser let out a curse, and I felt my stomach churn. We raised our rifles, cautiously advancing step by step. From the darkness behind the stone altar, a figure slowly emerged. It was taller than any human, with ash-gray skin and eyes that glowed eerily in the shadows. Sharp teeth glinted as it let out a low, menacing growl. A laser fired first, the gunshot echoing through the cave, but the creature moved like a shadow, easily evading the bullets. I followed up with my own shots, but they only hit empty air. The creature lunged at us with astonishing speed, its sharp claws raised as if to tear everything in its path. Eleazar screamed in pain as it flung him against the cave wall, blood pouring from a deep gash on his chest. I swung my rifle towards the creature, firing another round, and this time one of the bullets hit its mark. The creature let out a terrifying screech, a sound that reverberated through the confined space of the cave. It retreated, then disappeared into the dark depths, leaving us in a deadly silence. I rushed to Elieser's side. He was still alive, but he was bleeding heavily and in critical condition. I had no choice but to drag him out of the cave and seek help. We staggered back the way we came, all the while knowing that the creature was still out there, watching us from the shadows. Once outside, I immediately called for help. My colleagues quickly arrived and took Eliezer to the hospital, where he received timely medical attention. But strangely, when I recounted the story to the police and other rangers, no one believed what I said. They claimed the cave only contained ancient rock paintings, with no trace of the creature I described. The stone altar and the pile of bones had vanished as if they had never existed. Eliezer physically recovered, but his spirit was never the same. He decided to quit his job and move to a more distant place, far from the land he claimed was cursed. I also considered giving up, but something inside me couldn't let go. Perhaps it was the pride of being a ranger, or perhaps it was the curiosity to uncover the truth about what had haunted me since that day. In the weeks that followed, I continued to investigate on my own. I spent countless hours wandering through the desert, examining every hidden corner, every crevice in the rocks. But I found nothing. All traces of the creature had disappeared, as if it were nothing more than a nightmare. Yet, deep in my heart, I knew it was still out there, waiting for the right moment to reappear. One night, while I was on the night shift, I received a call from a couple camping in the park. They said they had seen a strange, tall creature with glowing eyes watching them from a distance. My heart raced as I listened to their description, but I tried to stay calm and told them to stay inside their tent until I arrived. When I got to the campsite, the area was eerily quiet. There were no signs of chaos or an attack. But as I examined the surroundings more closely, I noticed large footprints, similar to the ones I had seen before, leading into the forest. I grabbed my rifle and followed the tracks, my heart pounding, and my eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. The footprints led me to a cliffside, where I recognized the cave that Eleazar and I had entered before. I thought about turning back, but I couldn't let fear control me. I had to face that creature again, to understand it and put an end to this haunting. I entered the cave, this time more cautiously and prepared for whatever might come. Inside, everything looked just as it had before. The drawings on the walls, the chill in the air, and the stench of death. But this time, I wasn't alone. I could feel the presence of the creature, closer than ever. I ventured deeper into the cave, to the large chamber with the towering ceiling. The light from my flashlight illuminated a familiar scene. Crude stone altar, and on it, a new pile of bones. I raised my gun, ready for the confrontation. And then it appeared. The creature emerged from the darkness, its eyes glowing in the beam of my flashlight. It stood there, tall and powerful, with long arms and razor-sharp claws. I didn't shoot immediately. I wanted to understand it, to see if it was truly a monster. But as it began to move toward me, growling low in its throat, I realized there was no other choice. I pulled the trigger, and the gunshots echoed throughout the cave. The creature screeched, but this time it didn't flee. It charged straight at me. Claws raised. I backed away, firing another shot, but the creature was too close. I felt its strength as it knocked me to the ground, grabbing my shoulder and lifting me into the air. I struggled, punching it with my free hand, but its power was overwhelming. In that moment, I thought it was the end for me. But then, from somewhere deep within, a strange calmness arose. Couldn't let it win. I had to fight. With all the strength I had left, I raised my gun and shot it directly in the head. The bullet hit its mark, and the creature howled in pain. It released me, collapsing to the ground, black blood oozing from the wound. I stood up, gun still aimed, ready to shoot again if necessary. But the creature didn't move. It lay there, its body convulsing, then went still. I stood there for a few minutes, gasping for breath and trying to comprehend what had just happened. I had done it. I had killed it. I turned and left the cave, a wave of relief washing over me. But as I stepped outside, a cold wind blew past, carrying with it a strange whisper from afar. I stopped, fear creeping back in. I had defeated one creature, but was it the only one? That question still haunts me to this day. I left my job as a ranger after that event, moving to a more remote place, far away from the ghosts of the past. But I know that somewhere deep within the Petrified Forest desert, other creatures still lurk, waiting for the day they will reemerge. I have no intention of returning there, but I know that one day, someone else will have to face them. And when that time comes, they will need to be prepared, because these creatures are unlike anything humanity has ever known. My name is Elijah Talchief. I grew up in a small town in Montana, where the dense forests and vast grasslands were an inseparable part of life. Hunting and fishing were everyday activities, and I learned how to track and survive in the wild from my grandfather, who taught me everything about life in the wilderness. I always thought I knew these woods better than anyone else, but I was wrong. That summer, my cousin Jack and I decided to spend the weekend at our family's old cabin, deep in the woods. It was a place that held many childhood memories for us, where we had fished, hunted, and shared stories around the campfire. The cabin was old and a bit rundown, but to us it symbolized the peaceful days of our youth. We packed a bit of food, fishing gear, and a couple of old rifles. We didn't really think we'd need them. They were just part of the memories, a way to reminisce about the old days. First night passed without incident. We fished in the nearby creek and cooked the fish we caught over the campfire. The night sky was brilliant, with thousands of stars twinkling above. The air was fresh, and the scent of pine filled the air. Everything seemed so peaceful, as if time had turned back to those earlier days. The next day, Jack suggested we go further into the woods to explore an old quarry we had heard about, but had never dared to venture to. We were both excited by the idea, as it felt like a chance to relive the adventurous spirit of our teenage years. We packed the necessary supplies, rifles slung over our shoulders just in case. Path into the deep woods gradually became narrower, almost swallowed by nature, but we didn't mind. Our laughter and chatter filled the air, lightening the mood and dispelling the forest's gloom. But as we ventured deeper, a strange feeling began to creep in. The atmosphere grew unnaturally quiet. There were no birds singing or leaves rustling in the wind. This silence sent a chill down our spines, but neither of us said anything, perhaps not wanting to disrupt the sense of adventure. About an hour later, we reached the quarry. It was nothing more than a dark pit on the side of a hill, surrounded by rotting wooden beams at the entrance. We dared each other to step inside, but neither of us wanted to be the first. Instead, we decided to set up camp nearby and explore it the next day. That night, we sat around the campfire, eating canned beans and telling ghost stories. But the atmosphere around us was different. Unlike the times before, the familiar sounds of nature seemed to be stifled, leaving only an eerie silence and a vague sense of unease. We tried to blame it on the old quarry and our overactive imaginations, but deep down, we both knew something wasn't right. Around midnight, a sound echoed from a distance. At first it was just a faint noise, like something moving in the underbrush, but as the sound grew louder, it became clearer and more terrifying. It sounded like footsteps, but heavy and dragging, as if some massive creature was slowly approaching. Jack immediately stood up, gripping his rifle tightly and motioning for me to do the same. We both tried to listen, but we couldn't see anything in the darkness. "It's probably just a deer," Jack whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. We sat back down, but neither of us could rest. I kept my gun close, my eyes fixed on the shadows around us. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off to sleep, but it wasn't long before Jack woke me up. He was looking at me, his face pale in the dim firelight. "Elijah, wake up. There's something out there." There was fear in his voice, something I had never heard from Jack before. I immediately sat up, gripping my rifle. The sound had returned, louder and closer. We both stared into the darkness, straining to see something, anything, but there was only still, silent blackness. And then we saw it. At first I thought it was a person, but something was off. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, gangly arms and legs that bent at unnatural angles. Skin was pale, stretched tight over its bones, and its eyes glowed faintly in the night. It moved slowly, as if it was stalking us. Jack raised his gun and fired. The shot echoed through the forest, but the creature didn't flinch. It kept coming toward us, its eyes locked on us. I fired too, but my hands were shaking, and the shot went wide. "Run!" I shouted, and we took off into the woods, our hearts pounding in our chests. We ran until we couldn't run anymore, until we reached the old family cabin. We slammed the door shut and barricaded it with anything we could find. We sat against the door, panting, our rifles still clutched tightly, ready to fire if needed. "What the hell was that, Elijah?" Jack gasped, his eyes wide with fear. "I don't know," I replied, my mind racing. But it wasn't human. We sat there, too scared to close our eyes, too scared to move. Every noise in the night made us jump. Time dragged on, and the dawn seemed like it would never come. Finally, when the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the windows, we dared to look outside. The forest had returned to its eerie calm, as if nothing had happened. But we both knew we couldn't stay there another moment. We decided to pack up and head back to town, unwilling to face whatever was waiting for us in the darkness of another night. On the way back, we kept glancing around, never taking our eyes off the shadowy trees. But the creature didn't return. As we reached the edge of the forest, a sense of relief began to creep in, but the fear lingered, like a ghost haunting our minds. When we got back to town, we didn't tell anyone what we had seen. Who would believe us? They would think we were crazy. Instead, we told our family that the trip had been cut short due to bad weather. But both Jack and I knew the truth, and we never returned to that cabin again. Years passed, and life went on. Jack moved to Seattle, while I stayed in Montana, working as a mechanic. We kept in touch, but we never spoke about that night. It was like an unspoken pact, a heavy silence that we both understood couldn't be broken. One evening, I received a call from Jack's wife, Emily. Her voice was trembling, filled with panic. "Elijah, you need to come here immediately." "Jack? He's missing." A chill ran down my spine, and it felt like time had rewound to that night in the woods. "Missing? Where?" I asked, but I already had a feeling I knew the answer. He told me he wanted to go back to the cabin, to face something he never told me about. Emily choked out. I tried to stop him, but he wouldn't listen. I didn't need to think twice. I packed my things and drove through the night to Seattle. The whole drive, my mind was racing with memories, images of that creature, and the question of whether Jack was facing it again. When I arrived, I met Emily, who was completely distraught. The police had been notified, but they hadn't found any trace of Jack. I decided to search for him myself. I couldn't just sit and do nothing. I returned to that cabin, where my darkest memories were kept. It was dark, and I was alone facing the night. I brought weapons, but deep down I knew that if the creature was still there, they wouldn't help. The forest was as eerily silent as before, but this time I felt like something was watching me. I couldn't see it, but I had a distinct feeling that I wasn't alone. I reached the cabin, and as I opened the door, a foul stench hit me. I pulled out my flashlight and shone it inside. The room was empty, but there were signs of a struggle. Objects were overturned, a chair was broken, and there was a small smear of blood on the floor. A shiver ran down my spine as I shone the light into the darkest corner of the cabin. And then I saw it, its eyes glowing in the darkness. The creature was still there, still waiting. It didn't move, it just stood there, staring at me. I don't remember how I managed to run out of there. My legs felt numb, driven only by instinct to keep moving. When I got back to the car and drove away, I didn't dare look back. I knew I would never return to that place again. When I returned to town, the news of finding Jack left me choked up. His body was discovered a few miles from the cabin, horribly torn apart. The police concluded it was an animal attack. I knew the truth. I knew what had really happened. After the funeral, Emily left Montana, unable to face the painful memories. I stayed, but life was never the same. My dreams were filled with horrifying images, glowing eyes, and the constant feeling of being watched. I tried to carry on with my life. The fear lingered, like a ghost that couldn't be banished. I know that creature is still out there, lurking in the darkness. Perhaps it's still waiting for another chance to hunt. I can only hope that no one else has to face it, that no one else has to go through the horror that Jack and I experienced. But a part of me understands that this isn't the end. Maybe one day, that creature will return, and I will have to be ready, no matter what, because I know it will never stop. My name is Louis Standingbeck. I was born and raised in a small town called Shoshoni, deep in the heart of the Wyoming Basin. My family has lived here for generations, close-knit community where traditions and stories are passed down from one generation to the next like precious heirlooms. My life revolved around working at a nearby ranch, helping to take care of the livestock and maintaining the equipment. The work wasn't particularly exciting, but it gave me a certain peace, especially when I was under the vast open sky, feeling a connection to this land. However, that peaceful life was shattered one autumn evening in 1998. That night, I received a call from my cousin, Gerald Tall Elk. Gerald had always been a bit of an oddball, living alone in an old cabin deep in the woods. He enjoyed fixing up old cars and hunting during the off-season. But this call was different from usual. Gerald's voice was tense and full of panic. "Louis, I need you to come here right away," he said, offering no further explanation, only that he had discovered something very strange in the woods. The next morning, I drove to Gerald's place, navigating the bumpy dirt road through the thick trees. The air was bitterly cold, clear sign that winter was on its way. When I arrived, Gerald was already waiting on the porch, a cigarette hanging from his mouth, looking as disheveled as ever. He appeared as though he hadn't slept in days, with bloodshot eyes and a weary expression. "What's going on, Gerald? You sounded scared on the phone," I asked as I got out of the car. "Follow me," he said curtly, snuffing out his cigarette and leading me into the woods. We walked in silence, neither of us saying much. The cold grew more biting as we ventured deeper into the forest. After about 10 minutes of walking, Gerald stopped in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pine trees. "Look at this," he said, pointing to the ground where deep scratches and disturbed earth were clearly visible. I crouched down, examining the marks more closely, and realized that these scratches weren't made by any animal I'd ever seen. They were too large, too deep, and the shape was too strange to be the tracks of a bear or a wolf. "When did this happen?" I asked, feeling a cold shiver run down my spine. "A few nights ago," he replied. "I started hearing strange noises outside my house, like something was watching me. When I went to check, I found these scratches. They've been appearing around my place, getting more and more frequent." Gerald and I decided to set up some cameras around the area, hoping to catch whatever it was during the night. We spent the entire day placing the cameras, then returned to Gerald's house, where he had prepared a pot of venison stew for dinner. We sat on the porch, eating and staring out at the trees, both of us feeling as if we were being watched. As night fell, the wind began to blow through the forest, creating a rustling sound like the whispers of ghosts in the dark. After dinner, Gerald and I remained on the porch, guns in hand, flashlights within reach. We talked about old memories, about hunting trips from our younger days, but it was clear that our minds were preoccupied with the strange scratches we had found. Not long after darkness truly settled in, we heard the strange sound again. It was a low, deep noise like the groaning of a wounded animal, but much more eerie. Gerald and I immediately stood up, shining our flashlights into the forest ahead. The sound was coming from the clearing where we had found the scratches. "We should check it out," Gerald whispered, his voice tense. We slowly approached the area, our flashlights sweeping across every tree, every blade of grass. As we got closer, the sound became clearer, and it didn't resemble any animal noise I had ever heard. Then suddenly, we saw it. A tall, gaunt figure, hunched over among the trees. In the faint light of our flashlights, its skin appeared pale, almost waxy, and its eyes glowed eerily in the night. "Oh my God!" Gerald whispered, his voice trembling. He raised his gun, but before he could pull the trigger, the creature vanished, darting through the forest with incredible speed. Stood there for a few seconds, trying to comprehend what we had just seen, before quickly retreating to the house, locking the doors, and keeping watch throughout the night. When dawn broke, we checked the cameras, and to our astonishment, one of them had captured an image of the creature, a shadowy figure moving swiftly between the trees, blurry but unmistakably not human. We decided to take the footage to Sheriff Whitefeather, the head of the local police. He was a stern man who had seen his share of strange cases in the area, but as he watched the footage, even he couldn't hide his concern. "This is serious," he said after viewing it. "I've heard stories about things like this from ancient legend, but I never thought I'd see it with my own eyes." "What should we do?" Gerald asked, voice trembling. "I'll send a few deputies out here to patrol, but don't tell anyone about this. People will panic." For the next few nights, Gerald and I, along with a few deputies, kept watch over the area. But the creature didn't return. However, the feeling of being watched never went away. Forest, once a place of safety and peace, now felt ominous and threatening. Then one night, Gerald disappeared. I arrived at his house that morning, only to find the door wide open, his gun still lying on the porch. Outside, the ground was disturbed with the same kind of marks as before, deep scratches leading into the woods. We organized a search for Gerald that lasted for days, scouring every corner of the forest. There was no trace of him. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The deputies did everything they could, but eventually the search had to be called off. People in town started whispering about curses and ancient spirits. The town grew quieter, and the forest seemed to close in around us, as if it were hiding something. A few weeks later, I sat alone in my living room, staring at the footage we had captured. The sense of loss, not just of Gerald but of the peace we once had, haunted me constantly. I decided to go back to the clearing where we had first discovered the scratches. I needed closure, something to help me understand what was happening. I drove back to the forest, the sun setting behind the trees, casting long shadows. When I arrived, the clearing looked the same, but there was a heaviness in the air that I couldn't explain. I stood there for a while, feeling the weight pressing down on me. Then I heard it. A deep, low sound, like the growl of a wounded animal. I turned around, and before I could react, the creature emerged from the shadows, charging at me with terrifying speed. I fell to the ground, feeling a sharp pain in my side as it clawed at me. I tried to fight back, but it was too strong. Just before I lost consciousness, I heard its growl. A final thought flashed through my mind. This must be how Gerald died. I woke up in the hospital, with bandages wrapped around my side. A doctor explained that I had been found near my car, unconscious and injured. No one knew what had happened, and I couldn't remember everything. Fragments of memories, blurred images of the creature, still haunted me. Sheriff Whitefeather came to visit me, his face as serious as ever. "You're lucky to be alive, Lewis," he said, "but you need to leave. There's something in that forest, and it doesn't want to be disturbed." I left the hospital a few days later, returning home with nightmares that wouldn't stop. I knew I had to do something, but I wasn't sure what. The deputies still patrolled the area, but their presence didn't bring me any comfort. I could still feel the creature out there, watching and waiting. A few months later, strange events began happening in the town. Several people went missing after venturing into the woods, and other bodies were found in the same horrific condition as Gerald's, ripped apart and brutally ravaged. Rumors about the creature spread rapidly, and fear permeated the town. People started avoiding the forest, closing their doors earlier, and the town became darker and more foreboding than ever. I couldn't just sit and wait for the creature to strike again. I decided to find a way to confront it, one last time, to uncover the truth and try to stop it before it was too late. I didn't know what I would do if I encountered it again, but I knew I couldn't hide forever. I began preparing for my final journey into the forest. I geared up, carrying the most powerful gun and flashlight I had. I knew I might not come back, but I had no other choice. The night before I planned to go, I sat in my living room, staring into the darkness outside the window. I couldn't sleep. Fear and determination seemed to blend together in my mind. As dawn began to break, I stood up, grabbed my backpack, and stepped outside. Forest greeted me with an eerie silence. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, but I knew I wouldn't stop until I found some answers. I ventured deeper into the woods, each step feeling heavy under the weight of what I was about to face. When I reached the clearing where everything had begun, I paused, took a deep breath, and looked around. Nothing had changed, but the oppressive feeling in the air seemed to intensify, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Then I heard it, a low, rumbling growl, similar to the sound that creature had made. I raised my gun, ready for whatever was about to happen. But before I could react, the creature emerged from the shadows, charging at me with incredible speed. Everything became a blur as I fought against it, feeling surrounded by darkness and malice. I don't know how long I fought, but eventually I was struck down. Everything went black. I woke up in a dimly lit room, unaware of where I was or how I got there. All I knew was that I was still alive. That creature was still out there, and the battle between us was far from over. My name is Alonzo Redhawk, and the story I'm about to tell happened in 1997, in a small town in New York, deep within the Adirondack Mountains. It was a quiet place, forgotten by the outside world, where life moved slowly and simply. I worked as a mechanic at a local garage, fixing up old cars and helping neighbors with their broken engines. My life was as simple as the work I did, until one October weekend when a fishing trip turned into a nightmare that never seemed to end. My best friend, Sam Murdoch, and I had been planning this fishing trip for weeks. We decided to go to Blackwater Lake, a remote spot deep in the woods, a place only known to the locals. Sam and I had been there a few times before, and each time felt like the place brought a sense of tranquility and peace. Perfect escape from the routine of daily life. Early on Saturday morning, we loaded up Sam's old truck with all our gear and set off. The road took us through dense forests and winding paths, making it feel as though we were leaving civilization behind and stepping into another world, one where humans no longer existed. When we arrived at the lake late in the morning, the atmosphere felt different, eerie, as if it was draped in a cold, misty veil. But we were used to this. Blackwater Lake always had a melancholy beauty, as if it held secrets that no one else knew. We parked the truck by the roadside, gathered our gear, and walked down to the lake's edge. The place was quiet, with no signs of anyone else but us. Sam and I set up camp in a secluded corner by the lake, where we could see the still water reflecting the sunlight. The silence was so profound, we could hear every whisper of the wind through the trees. First day passed peacefully. We caught a few fish, grilled them over the fire, and sat around reminiscing, laughing about old memories. But when night fell, an uneasy feeling crept into my mind, as if something wasn't quite right. I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just the tension after a long day in the woods. We crawled into the tent to sleep, and everything seemed normal again. The second night, things started to get strange. Around midnight, I was awakened by an unusual sound. First, it was just a faint noise, like a distant whisper carried on the wind. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just the sounds of nature. But the whispering grew louder, like faint voices coming from somewhere near the water. I woke up, looked over at Sam, who was still sound asleep, and wondered if I should wake him. But before I could decide, I heard another sound, a noise like someone was moving around near our campsite. Outside the tent, the faint light of the moon cast a cold, eerie glow on the water. I sat up and slowly unzipped the tent a little, peering outside. first, I saw nothing but darkness in the still lake. But as I looked closer, I noticed a group of figures moving along the shoreline, walking in silence, dressed in long black robes, their faces hidden by hoods. They moved in a tight formation, as if they were performing some sort of ritual, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. My heart pounded, and the sense of unease grew stronger. This wasn't what I expected when we came to Blackwater Lake. I turned back to look at Sam, and immediately decided to wake him. "Sam, wake up," I whispered, trying not to make too much noise. Sam sat up, still groggy, looking at me with confusion. "What's going on?" "There's someone out there," I said, pointing outside. "I think we need to check it out." Sam quickly snapped out of his drowsiness, his eyes alert as he looked out of the tent. We stepped outside together, trying to move quietly, our footsteps soft to avoid drawing attention. The moonlight lit our path, and as we got closer to the lake, we could see them more clearly. The group of figures in black robes was standing in a circle near the water. They weren't saying a word, but there was an overwhelming sense of unease, as if something unnatural was present. I tried to listen. All I could hear were faint whispers, like indistinct voices echoing from far away. "What the hell is going on?" Sam whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't know," I replied, my eyes fixed on the robed figures. "We need to get out of here." We hurried back to the tent, quickly packing up our gear, and trying to leave as quietly as possible. But as we made our way back to the truck, feeling that something was watching us grew stronger. I glanced back at the lake, and a chill ran down my spine when I realized that the robed figures had vanished without a trace. We left Blackwater Lake in a hurry, neither of us saying a word. Even after we returned to town, the sense of unease lingered, clinging to me like a shadow. We tried to return to our normal lives, but it wasn't easy. Not long after, news of disappearances around the lake began to spread. First, it was a local hunter named Ben Cartwright who went hunting near the lake one weekend and never came back. His wife reported him missing, and a search party was organized, but no one found any trace of him. A week later, 2 other hikers vanished near the same area. Town became tense, and rumors started to circulate. People were worried, unsure of what was happening at Blackwater Lake. Sam and I couldn't stop thinking about what we had seen. We tried to rationalize it, convincing ourselves that it was just a coincidence, but neither of us truly believed that. Then one night, Sam showed up at my house, his face pale with fear. "We have to go back there," he said, his voice shaky. "I think they're watching us." I stared at him in disbelief. "Are you out of your mind? Why would we want to go back there?" "Because I've seen them," Sam said, his voice sounding more like he was trying to convince himself than me. "They were here in town. They're watching us." His fear began to seep into me, and even though my rational mind was telling me it was a crazy idea, I agreed to go with him. We gathered a few items: a flashlight, a hunting knife, and an old rifle that had belonged to Sam's grandfather, and headed back to Blackwater Lake, this time with heightened vigilance. By the time we arrived, it was already dark, and the atmosphere once again carried that eerie chill. We parked the truck some distance away from the lake and walked through the darkness, trying to stay quiet and hidden among the shadows of the trees. The surrounding environment grew more and more menacing, as if the very forest itself was conspiring against us. As we neared the shore, my heart pounded in my chest. But this time, there was no one there. The shoreline was empty, with only the sound of the wind whistling through the trees and the dark, still water shimmering under the moonlight. We stood there in silence, listening, but there was nothing, just an overwhelming stillness. "I think we should go back, Sam," I said, my anxiety growing stronger with every passing moment. But before we could turn back, a sound came from behind us. We turned around, and in the darkness, a group of people in black cloaks appeared, as if they had been there all along without us noticing. They moved slowly towards us, silent, with only the faint sound of their footsteps on the grass. "I think we should run," Sam whispered, his voice trembling with fear. We turned and ran. The cold air seemed to cling to us, slowing us down. The sound of footsteps grew closer, as if they were reaching out to grab us. I didn't dare look back, focusing only on running as fast as I could toward the truck. But before we could reach it, Sam stumbled and fell to the ground, his face pale. "I can't breathe," he said weakly. I helped him to his feet, trying to pull him forward, but the group of cloaked figures was closing in, surrounding us. There was no escape. I pulled out Sam's gun, raising it, but I wasn't sure if it would do anything against them. The darkness around us was thick, and in that moment, I felt a deep sense of despair. Just as I was about to pull the trigger, a blinding light shone directly on us. We heard the sound of vehicles and the blare of sirens in the distance. I realized it was the police. Patrol had arrived just in time. Cloaked figures backed away, as if the light had stripped them of their power. As the police headlights swept over the area, they vanished into the shadows, leaving no trace behind. The police took us back to safety, but our explanations were met with skeptical looks. There was no evidence of what we had seen, only our fear and exhaustion. They recorded the incident, but no one truly believed our story. Sam and I returned home, but our lives were never the same. We were haunted by what we had witnessed, feeling that the cloaked figures were still watching us from afar. Blackwater Lake became a forbidden place. No one in the town dared go near it anymore. The disappearances continued, but no one ever found the cause or the culprits. Everyone knew something was wrong, but they couldn't explain it or face it. I am still alive, but I am no longer the person I used to be. The fear and the sense of being watched constantly haunt me, never letting go. At night, I often wake up in a start, feeling the gaze of someone staring at me from the darkness. I know they are still out there, waiting and silently observing. And I don't know if one day they will return. My name is Roger Silas, a member of the Ho-Chunk tribe, born and raised in a small town deep in northern Wisconsin, a place that might not even appear on many maps. I work as a guide for tourists who want to explore the dense forests and crystal-clear lakes of this region. The job isn't glamorous, but it's enough to make a living and keeps me connected to the land, the heritage of my ancestors. However, events that unfolded during a distant autumn changed my quiet life forever. In the fall of 1997, on a chilly morning filled with the scent of the approaching winter, I received a call from a group of tourists from Chicago. Two young couples, eager to experience the wilderness of this land, had heard about me from a previous acquaintance and wanted to hire me as their guide for a 2-day trip. I had encountered many different types of people throughout my years in this line of work, but there was something about this group that caught my attention. They were full of excitement, but unfamiliar with this land. I worried whether they could withstand the harshness of the forest, but their enthusiasm convinced me. I prepared the necessary equipment and briefed them on the itinerary, reminding them of the things they needed to know about the forest. We set off early in the morning, just as the sun began to peek over the horizon, casting a soft golden light on the towering trees. The trail into the forest was beautiful and serene, but the atmosphere grew eerier as we ventured deeper. The forests of Wisconsin in the fall are breathtaking, with the leaves turning shades of red, orange, and yellow, creating a vibrant tapestry. I felt a sense of pride as I led these people through the land of my ancestors, sharing with them the legends, stories of the Ho-Chunk people, the sacred spirits of the forest, and the lessons that my forebears had passed down. After several hours of walking, we stopped at a small stream to rest and have lunch. The air grew cooler as the sun climbed higher. I couldn't help but notice the strange silence of the forest that day. Normally there would be the sound of birds singing, the rustling of falling leaves, but that day Everything seemed to be enveloped in an unusual stillness. A sense of unease crept into my heart, as if something was lurking in the shadows of the trees. "Roger, is everything okay?" Tom, one of the tourists, asked, noticing the unease on my face. "Yeah, just lost in thought for a bit," I tried to reply casually, attempting to push away the worry gnawing at me. "We should keep moving. We still have some distance to cover before we reach the campsite." We continued our journey, trekking through the leaf-covered trails, and eventually arrived at the old log cabin where we would spend the night. This cabin, a relic from a long-forgotten settler, was a simple wooden structure with a fireplace and a few wooden beds. I had been here many times before. This time, something felt different. The cabin seemed more abandoned than usual, and I had the unsettling feeling that it was no longer the safe haven it once was. Tourists were excited, taking photos and soaking in the surroundings. As dusk began to settle, I started a fire in the fireplace. Cold air and light breezes slipping through the cracks in the cabin made a soft whistling sound, adding to the eerie atmosphere. As night fell, we gathered around the fireplace, enjoying a simple dinner and sharing ghost stories. I told them about the spirits in Ho-Chunk legend, tales of the forest creatures that my ancestors believed still lurked somewhere in the shadows of these woods. These stories usually left visitors both frightened and